Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
Chinese and U.S. top officials are in Paris for economic and trade talks. Meanwhile, official data shows China's industrial output is up 6.3% in the first 2 months of this year, and the key allies have been holding back after Washington urged help to secure the Strait of Hormuz. Welcome to World Today, a news program with a different perspective. I'm Anna in Beijing. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. Our top story: high-level discussions between Chinese and U.S. delegations on economic and trade issues continue in Paris on Monday. Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng already met with U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent over the weekend. China has vowed to safeguard its legitimate development interests and uphold the stability of the multilateral trading system and the global trade order. To delve into this, let's have Dr. Zhao Hai, the Director of International Political Studies at the National Institute for Global Strategy at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Dr. Zhao Hai, China and the U.S. is holding another round of high-level economic and trade talks in Paris. There's a lot of debate internationally. Some people think this round could bring meaningful progress, while others say there is very little common ground left. What's your take? Where do you see these talks heading?
I think it really depends on how you set the standard. Where is the bar? If you set the standard of, for instance, the last year when Trump started a new trade war with China and escalating the tariff to 145%, then of course, I think this year it will be much better. The relationship will be stabilized and two sides will talk about purchase, investment, and even lower tariff. However, if you set the bar, if you want to roll back to Biden years or even earlier, I think it's unrealistic because the Trump administration is sort of a signal that they will continue to keep the current tariff and that they're making plans to continue to do so. So I think at current stage, both sides are having a very realistic goal of stabilizing the relationship and continue to manage the trade relationship so that both sides would not have upset the current status quo.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. It all comes down to how we define the standards. As many put this, just the fact that both sides are still talking, especially about tariffs, is already seen as a positive sign. Dr. Zhao Hai, reports say the first day touched on things like we've already seen this before, agriculture, critical minerals, and even some form of managed trade. So from your perspective, how do you assess the top agenda items this time?
I think those items you mentioned have been talked about in previous rounds of talks. In particular, the U.S. wanted to talk about phase one trade deal in which China has committed to purchase agriculture, airplanes, natural gas, coal, other energy products. So this is quite natural that the U.S. continue to try to push China to buy more. And this is not something new. I think this time around, the new idea of Board of Trade is pretty important because if both sides can establish such board and using mechanism moving forward, they can find a communication lines that they can always use and try to pick out difficulties and resolve them bilaterally. So I think this is something they need to go into more detail and design a mechanism that both sides can agree upon. And that is quite similar to phase one trade deal. For instance, there's dispute settlement mechanisms, but this time around, managed trade is more important at the center of this idea, where both sides can find out exactly what areas are so-called non-sensitive areas, and they can lower tariff and promote more trade between the two sides.
Mm-hmm. Then building on that, at the same time, what do you see as the biggest sticking points right now, and where might it be hardest for the two sides to reach an agreement?
Well, one of the key areas is President Trump refused to give up ideas to raise tariff because, as we all know, Supreme Court has denied his using of IEEPA as legal basis to raise tariff across board. So now he resort to Section 122 and will maintain 10 to 15% of tariff around the globe. Next step, because we all know that 122 can only last 150 days, and after that, it's not likely that the Congress will continue to authorize him to extend the tariff. So he's going to replace that tariff with more. As we all know, that he is pushing out, trying to design the next phase of tariff using Section 301, in which China are on both lists. So I think that will be the future point of contention when both sides return to the negotiation table.
Mm-hmm. Last week, the U.S. also launched two new Section 301 probes, one on the so-called forced labor and another on the so-called industrial overcapacity. Same old story again. So how do you see the timing and purpose of these probes, especially right before the talks?
Well, I don't think this announcement of two new 301 investigations are particularly aimed at this particular summit. It is designed to resume once Section 122 expires. So they have to start the investigation now because they need to finish the process. But as you mentioned, that the two reasons, one is overcapacity, the other one is so-called forced labor. These are the words that the United States have been using against China, trying to use that as a leverage, as a reason to raise tariff against China, to play it unfair. But this time around, as we noticed, that the U.S. is not just aiming at China, but aiming at dozens and dozens of countries. Apparently wanted to replace 122 with the new 301. So we will continue to monitor the situation and see whether the U.S. will treat China differently from other countries. If so, I think we will have a new problem.
Mm-hmm. Some analysts say that the U.S. may actually be more eager than China to sit down and talk this time. Do you agree with that rating? And if so, what pressures might be driving Washington's urgency?
I think this time around, it's hard to see the urgency on both sides, particularly on the working level, because there are many hurdles that they need to cross. And there are many details they need to negotiate before they can reach agreement. However, if you look at President Trump, he seems to be eager to visit China since the last summit at Busan between the two top leaders. And I think there are a number of particular reasons that he wants to visit China and try to reach a deal, because domestically, he's under pressure to deliver, particularly against the high inflation that is going on in the United States. And this year is the midterm election. And so far, he hasn't given a perfect answer to his political promise during the campaign that he will reduce inflation and also lower prices. So again, I think balanced trade, asking China to buy more, will please his base in the agricultural states, and also import more cheaper Chinese goods probably will lower the inflation expectations. So in both cases, he would want to reach agreement in China and also declare victory when he returns. And also, in addition to that, of course, if he can attract some Chinese investments in the states that he's designated to, will benefit him politically as well. However, again, I think at this point, in order to reach that agreement, he needs to also make concessions and reaching a balanced deal with China. And so far, I think politically it's quite difficult for him to make any concessions.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Zhang Hai, let's bring in another factor. The U.S. has recently launched strikes against Iran, and some reports say the conflict is already starting to affect the U.S. economy. How might the Iran factor influence the U.S. economy today and possibly Washington's stance in these trade talks?
Well, that's a difficult question because I can go on for a day to talk about the negative impacts that the current Trump administration is doing in the Gulf, and particularly continue to bomb Iran together with Israel. This military operation has caused a severe problem, a severe crisis on global economy because of the close of the Strait of Hormuz. And so far, we don't have any sign that this strait will be open anytime soon. And as we all know, that the strait is not only controls 20% of world crude oil, but also more than 20% of natural gas and many, many other resources that the world needs. So at this point, I think people are watching the situation very closely. The market has already been down in the last 2 weeks. And if this situation cannot be resolved in the next 2 weeks, I think you will see a wider range of global market collapsing, and also a wave of financial as well as economic difficulties around the world. So far in Asia, there are already countries starting to show the symptom of the shortage of energies. Even though with the strategic petroleum being released, I think it can only last for a month or so. So after that, the people will still have to face the continuous global shortage of supply of energy. So I think at this point, if China and the United States have a summit, this will be a critical issue that both sides needs to talk about. And President Trump has already threatened to China, said that he will delay the visit if China does not help him with the situation. But this is very much his own making. And without him trying to figure out a way to move forward and try to reach out to Iran and negotiate a settlement, it's very hard for any other country to intervene and resolve the issue in a short period of time. So again, I think that's why this summit is very important. Two largest economies needs to come together and talk about these critical issues that will have a major impact on global economy. But I think for China, this is very much an issue that created by the United States, and President Trump needs to resolve this or have a plan before he comes to China.
Mm-hmm. Then let's flip the perspective and talk about China. How do you think Beijing sees this new round of talks? And is China approaching this differently compared with the previous rounds?
Well, if you listen to Foreign Minister Wang Yi's recent press conference, he has made this very clear that 2026 is a very key year for bilateral relationship between U.S. and China. And he also stated that this year's bilateral relationship will be championed by the head of state diplomacy. So I think China is showing high degree of attendance to this coming summit. However, it's the U.S. side that is not paying attention and being very well prepared coming into the summit. Other than this visit, Trump's visit to China, President Xi is supposed to return the visit to the United States. And later on, there's also important multilateral conference, including APEC and G20, that will be held in each country. Moving forward throughout the year, China and the U.S. will continue to interact with each other. And the best case scenario, of course, is two countries working together to solve global problems and facing global challenges. And the worst case scenario is that the U.S. refuse to talk to China and continue to raise the bar problems and difficulties, preventing China and U.S. working together on economic and investment and many other geopolitical hotspot issues. So we will see what's going to come out of next, because I think the U.S. needs to put their own house in order before they can really seriously sit down with China and have a good negotiation and have a good outcome that the world expects.
Thanks for those insightful analysis. That was Dr. Zhang Hai, the Director of International Political Studies at the National Institute for Global Strategy at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Coming up, official data shows China's industrial output is up 6.3% in the first 2 months of this year. This is World Today. Stay with us.
Welcome. I am Chu Zhang, Deputy Director at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Fudan University. On the World Today program, we will dive beyond the headlines to uncover the stories, trends, and impacts that connect states across the globe. Join me on World Today.
You've been listening to World Today. Let's move on to China's economy. The latest official data shows the year has started on a solid footing. China's value-added industrial output, a key economic indicator, went up more than 6% over a year ago in the first 2 months of this year. The country's service industry production index increased by over 5%. The total import and export of goods rose by more than 18%, while the retail sales of consumer goods were up by nearly 3%. So for more on this, joining us on the line is Dr. Zhou Mi, Senior Research Fellow with the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Zhou Mi.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Zhou Mi, China's economy got off to a very strong start in January and February, with many indicators beating expectations. So how do you view this overall performance?
In my understanding, I think that the performance is really good because, when we're seeing the world is under so many pressures, So many countries are suffering from different kind of uncertainties brought by the protectionism of the trade and the change or reconstruction of the global supply chain. But China's performs so well compared with last year. The first 2 months has reached a historical high about the GDP. So in my understanding, I think that there are several different factors to have this, but one general principle or reason is that after almost 1 year of uncertainties brought by the United States, many countries in the world is supporting the decision of China, and they want to build a better and stronger connections with China. So it's not just about our very sudden reason or sudden factors of development. It is based on accumulated factors, deterioration of United States in the global governance. So in my understanding, if you're looking at the different structure, different factors, no matter from the domestic factors or from the foreign trade factors, all of them are really strong to support the development of China. And in my understanding, that is outperformed our expectation, even when we are, trying to make the goal of the development of the GDP this year for 4.5 to 5%. I think these first 2 months are really very important for supporting us to have that result.
Then speaking of the overall performance, consumption, industrial output, and exports all beat forecasts, while the property sector is relatively weak. How do you interpret this mixed two-speed economic picture?
Well, the real estate is not just our very short term of phenomena. We can find that in the past or in the previous several years, the real estate suffering a lot from the prices of the houses not so well, and many pressures coming from the stock of the houses. But I don't think that is because that the economy is not good. That is because that the Chinese government they really want the real estate to have a healthy development. So in the previous several years, we have watched that the real estate in China in different cities are changing their patterns of development from some of the portfolio investment or some of speculation investment to our sustainable development, and we are carrying more demand from the lower income classes and also want to make the people have a better and sustainable development. Well, as for other sectors, and I think that the confidence not just comes from the government, the confidence are really coming from the market. The market are really giving a better and stronger support for the development. If you look at some of the indicators of the real estate itself, it's recovering. It's not dropping that quickly, compared with several years before. So I would say that the general trend is not just the two tracks of development, but they are moving to the same direction, maybe not in the same speed.
A soft landing on the property sector. Dr. Zhemi, industrial output rose 6.3% and high-tech manufacturing jumped 13.1%. What does this set of numbers mean for China's new growth drivers today?
Well, it's really a remarkable performance in my understanding, because for these new areas, for this new energy or some of the digital products, China is really performing quite good. I think that there are maybe two reasons. The first one is that Chinese government is really working hard to try to drive, the new economies in a better way. So we are able to provide new rooms for the companies who are trying to be involved in the sectors to be depending on the innovation to have a better and higher quality of development. A second reason coming from our trading partners. They really want to also have this better performance about green transition, about the sustainable development. So they can import the products, especially the equipment like the new energy vehicles from China, and they can also benefit from that with affordable prices and systematic way of supplying. So in this regard, I think that this shows the world that China is not just trying to provide the world with traditional products with a very massive scale. We are really trying to give the world many solutions on transferring from the traditional ways into our new ways. So this really are in the demand of our trading partners, and we also hear from them we are trying to improve our technology based on the demand. So we are really at the hub of the world, and we provide so many new engines for the better development.
Speaking of moving up to the next level and to delve deeper into the high quality development, we see equipment manufacturing and new energy products posted sharp growth as well. What does this tell us about China's manufacturing upgrade, and to what extent does it reflect progress toward higher value and more advanced manufacturing?
As for the enterprises, I think the main reasons why they want to put their money is whether their investment could be sustainable, could be profitable, or they have less risk. So in my understanding, the reason why they dare to do that, because the Chinese government really publishing the catalogs of introducing new, productive forces, and also trying to give the markets very long term of expectation. So they create a better and more transparent and foreseeable market for the enterprises to put their money in. And second is that, it's not about the foreign trade partners. Even in China, we are creating so many different kind of scenarios to do with the new development. And the Chinese people really want to experience these new things. So in these two sides, I think that the market is really feeling that. They also want to have a better and more sustainable development. So they choose to put their money there, and they can also benefit from the very sound supply chains in China who can help them to realize their inventions from the laboratories into the market practices.
Then besides the optimistic picture of Chinese economy, authorities also warned of rising geopolitical risks. So how will external pressure shape China's trade and growth for the full year?
Well, yeah, this is really a problem. Like the director Zhao Hai has just mentioned, that there are so many uncertainties from the geopolitical tensions. So in my understanding, I think China is very firm in this kind of status or kind of affairs that we supporting the people. We are trying to make all of these related partners to stay together to discuss about the ways to resolve these problems. The logistics is not just a crossing or passing by some countries or regions. They are really connecting the different markets and the factories. Like, what is happening now in the Middle East and also in the Eastern Europe is something really giving a lot of pressures on the global market, on the commodities prices, on the logistics supply. I think that is really harmful. So in my understanding, we are really want to encourage the related stakeholders to think about this issue, not just to talk about something with themselves. They are really having many connections of the world. But if they are not able to deal with the problems in the short term, in my understanding that the market will react accordingly. Many companies are really start to trying to change their patterns of the trade and investment. So in this regard, I would say the market really have many strengths to deal with this uncertainty. And I believe that is also based on the market principles of eco development and better productive in the innovation areas.
That's very insightful. Thanks, Dr. Zhou Mi, for your valuable insights. That was Dr. Zhou Mi, Senior Research Fellow with the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation. More to come. Key allies have been holding back after Washington urged help to secure the Strait of Hormuz. Rising tensions in the Middle East are starting to ripple through the global economy, including the United States. We'll also take a look at China's world's first approval of an invasive brain-computer interface product for market use. You're listening to Road Today. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching Road Today. We'll be back after a short break. You've been listening to Road Today with me, Anna, in Beijing. U.S. President Donald Trump has warned that NATO could face a very bad future if allies fail to join a coalition to police the Strait of Hormuz. Trump says he has requested about 7 countries to send warships to help keep the waterway open, through which roughly 1/5 of the world's traded oil normally passes. He did not name the countries. So far, France and Australia have confirmed they will not send warships. Japan says it has no plans to deploy naval assets, while South Korea is still reviewing the matter. Meanwhile, Iran's top diplomat states that the Strait of Hormuz remains open to all countries except the United States and Israel. So for more on this, my colleague Xu Yawen spoke with Wang Jing, professor at Northwest University in Xi'an, China.
Professor Wang, President Trump has asked U.S. allies to join a coalition to, here I quote, police the Strait of Hormuz by sending warships. But he has received little support so far. Why do you think U.S. allies are reacting coldly to his appeal?
Well, I think his allies rejected his opinion, I think, based upon 2 factors. On the one hand, I don't think their allies reject Donald Trump's opinion based upon the military way, but I think their rejections are based upon their diplomatic and political decisions. Because from their perspective, they believe Iran maybe should be responsible for the closure of the Hormuz Strait. But then on the other hand, I think their allies understand very deeply that only pressure towards Iran could not solve the problem, could not end the crisis, could not end the war. And the closure of the Hormuz might continue and would further provoke much more escalation of tension in the region. So that's why they don't want to send military forces to so-called the safeguards of the Hormuz Strait. And also on the other hand, I think they also feel kind of the suspicious towards United States possible kind of arrangements, because who would lead the naval forces and who would lead the military forces, and who should command all of the forces composed by different states, different nations. This is a very, very sensitive topic. So that's why I think they also have to face political pressure, political opposition opinions at home. So that's not an easy task. So therefore, I think maybe Donald Trump wants to do something to end the war and by imposing new pressure towards Iran, but I don't think it would be an easy task, particularly by gathering his allies all across the world.
Actually, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi says the Strait of Hormuz is open to everyone except the U.S. and Israel. We have also seen that over the weekend, 2 Indian tankers transit safely. So for countries other than the U.S. and Israel, does this suggest that the immediate threat to their shipping might actually be lower than political risk of aligning with Washington's military action?
Well, I think the problem is that we're talking about something who has the conflicting ideas, conflicting perceptions that matters. Because when we're talking about this kind of the divisions, kind of the different ideas, we're talking about the different understandings of the war. Because some countries believe that the war was attributed to the responsibilities of the United States and Israel because they started the war rather than Iran. Well, maybe from the United States and Israel, maybe some countries, they believe that Iran should be responsible for the ongoing crisis, particularly ongoing escalation of the tension around the Hormuz Strait, because Iran closed the Hormuz Strait, and Iran called for much more attacks against the targets in the neighboring countries, although they are neighboring countries' military bases belonging to the United States. So that's why we're talking about different ideas and different divisions. So it's very difficult for a kind of end of war within the short term, although the United States wants to give new pressure, although Israel maintains that they will continue the strike, although that maybe the United States has much more kind of the privilege to mobilize more forces globally. But again, as we say, we're talking about the different understandings over the war, reasons of the war, over the futures of the war, over the roles of different countries in the war. So that would be the very long war that would continue. And that means if any state understand the war by their own understandings, very, very rationally, very, very within the hurry, I don't think these will help solve the problem. It will actually further provoke much more escalation and much more uncertainties.
We have also noticed that some European countries who are also NATO members are pursuing diplomacy with Iran rather than joining the US to what the US called police the Strait of Hormuz. For instance, we saw France and Italy are engaging in direct talks with Iran, while Britain's foreign minister is on a state visit to Saudi Arabia, discussing the continuity of oil supplies with Gulf states. So, are we witnessing a trust crisis here between US and its allies when it comes to how they should handle its relations with Iran?
Of course, of course. I think actually what we're talking about is the deepening divisions between United States and its allies, particularly between United States and the European countries. Because on the one hand, the two sides, United States on the one side and the European countries on the other side, they have different understandings over how the war started. Maybe that from the United States perspective, that Iran's closure of Hormuz Strait should be suspended, should be deterred. But from the United States perspective, the deterrent should only be realized by military way. But maybe from the European countries, they understand very clearly that Iran had the pressure Iran suffered. And also they understand very clearly that Iran might continue and maybe further impose more kind of the closure efforts to the Hormuz Strait once pressure from European countries were added to Iran. So that's why I think Iran's behavior are much more rational rather than the very military way and the coercive way that the United States behaves. And also, on the other hand, I think it suggests the very, very different kind of the surroundings the United States and the European countries face. Because from United States, actually their energy structure, energy system, they have already produced the largest oil in this world. And the oil, particularly the so-called shale oil that the United States produced, has already met the internal marketing demands. But then from the European countries' perspective, they are now facing the very, very growing energy crisis. And they rely very heavily upon the energy transported from the Gulf Arab states. And they rely on very heavily of the Hormuz Strait, which is very crucial for their energy transportation. That's why they have different ideas. So that's why the division now become more and more clear and more deep.
Lastly, Professor, at this point, with Iran offering passage to most nations and the U.S. threatening to hit Iran's oil infrastructure again after previously striking military targets on Kark Island, what are the realistic prospects for diplomacy to resolve this conflict?
Well, I think diplomacy should always be expected, should always be hoped, should always be pursued, because the diplomatic way is the only way that peace could come back very fast and the stability could be maintained for quite a long term. But the problem is that even that we're talking about the diplomatic way, it should be based upon trust, should be based upon the ceasefire, should be based upon the mutual understandings of the difficulties that nobody could resist. But then what we're looking at and what I'm witnessing is still the growing distrust between two sides, growing hostilities and growing hardliner rhetorics against each other. That makes diplomacy very difficult. And also, on the other hand, we cannot forget that the United States, Israel on the one hand, and Iran on the other hand, they are now gathering more forces internally and externally to attack the other side. And particularly, the United States, as the very country who started the war, now is calling for much more aggressive words and terms against Iran, which will harm the surroundings, the positive surroundings about the possible future. So that's why I think although diplomacy could work, but it might take long term. So wars are always very easy to be started, but would be always difficult to be ended.
How long do you think it will last?
Well, I think maybe in the last another 2 weeks, once the United States they send their Marines or the land forces occupy parts of Iranian territories or some islands, particularly the cargo islands in the Gulf region, which is very crucial for Iranians exporting energy system. It would lead to new escalation of the war.
That was Wang Jing, professor at Northwest University in Xi'an, China, speaking with Xu Wen. This is World Today. We'll be back.
Hello, I am Dr. Digby James Wren, a political analyst and international relations scholar specializing in China area studies. World Today offers unmatched in-depth perspectives on China's politics, economics, business, technology and society. World Today's team of reporters and contributors provides valuable information from all of the world's major economies. I hope you can join me on World Today for the very best insights and news from China, on China, and help to build a better understanding of China's role in the world today.
You're back with World Today. Rising tensions in the Middle East are beginning to ripple through the global economy. After the recent U.S.-Israeli strikes against Iran, oil prices have surged to around $100 a barrel, pushing gasoline prices higher in the United States and raising fresh concerns about inflation. That shift is changing expectations for the Federal Reserve monetary policy. Wall Street investors had been anticipating several interest rate cuts from the U.S. Central Bank this year, but they are now scaling back on those bets. According to a survey, U.S. consumer sentiment fell in early March as households worried about personal budgets. With more, my colleague Zhao Yang spoke with Yan Liang, the professor of economics at Willamette University.
So, Yan, thank you very much for joining us. Just weeks ago, markets were expecting several rate cuts from the Federal Reserve this year, but now investors and the forecasters are pricing almost none. So, what has happened, and how do you explain that?
Well, I think that's largely due to the war against Iran. This is, the United States and Israel, they started to have, the attack since February the 28th. So now it's been, almost 2 weeks. So I think that is really created a lot of concerns on the market because Iran's counterattack was pretty much trying to blockade the Strait of Hormuz. And so that, pretty much blocked 20% of the global crude oil's transportation. And I think there is also a sign of escalation of the conflict where some of the oil infrastructure, right, may be under risk. So I think all of this just drove up the global concern about oil price. As a matter of fact, the Brent crude has gone up from the previous over $70 to now over $100 a barrel. So that has consequential impact on the global oil supply and also inflation, as well as inflation expectation. So I think that is why the Fed will need to think twice before they can move to the next cut. So I think some of the analysts now even think that the Fed may delay another cut until the middle of 2027. I would say the situation is still very fluid. No one knows exactly the Trump administration's objectives of the war, and therefore there's no really clear indication when it's going to end. So I think that would really create a lot more uncertainty in terms of how inflation and how the war are going to evolve.
And as you mentioned, oil is a really big consideration for everyone right now. So how significant is this energy shock for the broader U.S. economy, do you think?
Well, I think it's clear that the United States, even though it is one of the largest producer of oil, it is still a net importer of oil. So I think overall, because the international energy market is very much connected, so the United States will not be able to shield itself completely from the rising energy price. So again, we already saw the gas price in the U.S. has gone up from the previous close to $3 per gallon to now over $3.40 per gallon on average. And it's likely, as long as the war drags on, as long as the international oil price continues to rise, then I think, the gas price in the United States will also continue to rise. Not to mention, I think with this war disruption, there will be also disruptions on international travel, shipping, as well as supply chain, and so on. And so all of this, I think, will have a negative impact on the U.S. Not to mention, the war is very costly, right? In the first week, I think the U.S. has already spent about $11 billion, between $11 and $12 billion on the war. So going forward, this would create some fiscal strain on the U.S. government. So overall, I think this war is going to increase inflation and also reduce GDP growth. So I think some of the economists already start to warn about stagflation of the U.S. economy. So that is really, very negative for the U.S. economy.
And if oil stay near $100 or even higher, what does it mean for the consumer spending in the months ahead?
Right. So we already know the U.S. Consumers already have weaker sentiment. According to the Michigan's University's, the consumer sentiment survey, they already saw the consumer sentiment has gone down. And also the U.S. GDP number was revised. Last quarter in 2025, the U.S. economy grew only at 0.7% as opposed to 1.4% as previously forecasted or estimated. So one of the major revision is the decline in the consumer spending. So now, with this war, with the rising prices of energy, this is going to create a lot more strain on the households' budgets. The estimate is that for every 10% increase in the gas price, the U.S. consumers would have to spend $450 more. So now when you think about, the gas price has gone up quite a bit, about I would say at this point around 30%. So that's a significant strain on the government, on the households' budgets, right? So the annual increased spending by the current estimate, right, would reach about $1,300 per year. So this would again constrain the household spending on any sort of discretionary items, right? Because they have to spend more on the fuel and also heating costs and many other, expenses. And again, the U.S. economy is driven by consumer spending. So if the consumers feel less confident about the economy, they're facing higher energy costs and reduce spending on other discretionary items. This would again dampen the U.S. economy.
And with oil prices rising, we are seeing the gold weaken and U.S. stocks sell off at the same time. So how do you explain this market reaction? And in this environment, where is global capital actually flowing?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think for the U.S. stock market, it's quite clear that because inflation pressure is up, and because also it's expected, the U.S. government will have to spend more on the war effort. And so all these concerns will dry up the bond yields. So it's possible that some of the funds that will invest in the stock market are now diverted into the bonds market. So that's why you're likely to see the stock market, tank. And also, I think, as we mentioned earlier, right, this kinds of uncertainty is very bad on consumer and also on business confidence. So without the strong confidence, I think the stock market would again reflect the kind of investors' jittery, sort of sentiment. And I think going forward, as long as the war drags on, there will be also more consequences on the global supply chain, right? For example, helium is one important ingredient in producing chips. And Qatar is accounting for about 30% of the helium supply in the global market. So without this essential ingredient, this could weigh on, investments in semiconductor industry and production in the industry. So in other words, that would affect a lot of the tech stocks and also AI stocks. So I think all of this could weigh on the stock market. Now, gold is an interesting story because, again, usually in the times of uncertainty, there will be more, sort of flight to safety, and therefore gold price typically will increase. But now that's not the case. I think according to some of the, stock analysts or more of the technical analysis, it has to do with the liquidity drain from some of the investors. In order to get some more cash, they pretty much just liquidate some of the gold, right? They sell gold to profit on it, to also get the liquidity that they need. So that's why you're not seeing gold price rising, but actually declining. So overall, I think there will be more diversification from the U.S. stock markets and U.S. dollar assets towards other areas. But that said, I think, again, because of a lot of uncertainty right now in the market, and Asian economies are also quite significantly affected, right, by this kind of oil shock, because the Asian markets very much rely on the Middle East oil. And Europeans' economy are also going to be affected, right? Because they already had some energy sort of constraint, and now it's becoming more so. Middle East usually is cash abundant by selling oil, but because the war, the European economies are also seeing a lot of loss, right? Arguably over $15 billion of potential loss in oil revenues. So overall, I think the global economy is not looking good because of all these different negative impacts due to the war.
That was Yan Liang, a professor of economics at Willamette University, speaking with Zhao Yang. Now let's turn to China's world-first approval of an invasive brain-computer interface product for market use, which paves the way for its clinical application. Developed by Neurotechnology Technology, the implantable system is designed to help restore hand motor function in patients with spinal cord injuries. About the size of a coin, the device collects and decodes brain signals in real time, allowing patients to control a pneumatic glove to perform actions such as grasping objects or picking up items. The BCI sector has also been designated a future industry in this year's government work report, highlighting China's growing push in neurotechnology. So for more on this, let's bring in Andy Mock, a professor at Beijing Foreign Studies University. Thanks for joining us, Andy.
Always a pleasure, Glenna.
Andy, Neuraco, the company, obtained China's first and also the world's first commercial approval for an implantable BCI device. What milestone does this mark for the global BCI industry?
Well, I think this is a pivotal transition from what has been an experimental technology, a research application, to something that can be delivered in a hospital setting with required medical approvals. Basically, it's, to use a very American phrase, it's ready for prime time. So I think this is very, very important and represents a very important milestone of Ghana.
Can you give us a quick intro into this implantable BCI device, and when might that be used in the hospitals, for example?
Well, I think it's first important to understand, what do we really mean by BCI or brain-computer interfaces? So there's three levels, right? So one, it can be something you put on your head that can pick up your brain signals. The second is, maybe we can call it semi-invasive, meaning you still have to go through the skull, but then you put a device like this one, which is, as you mentioned, about the size of a coin, on the surface of the brain. So that's one way. And then the third way is to actually go deeper into the brain with electrodes. And the difference here is that obviously the deeper you go, the more complex it is, the more chance there is for something to go wrong. But very importantly, for what we're talking about today, it's more difficult to gain regulatory approval for medical ethics as well. So it really changes the risk calculation. So I think what China is doing here is really taking this middle path where it's important to be, I think, inside the skull, because you can gain a lot of experience, you gain more signal than you would being outside, but of course not as much as you would if you were to stick an electrode deeper into the brain. So I think it shows that this is the middle ground. It shows, I think, also China's ability and its approach to making important technological advances and breakthroughs, but not as an isolated breakthrough, but really building the system that delivers tangible value to many, many patients. So China has the largest population of patients with spinal cord injuries. So this is going to have a very real impact on people's lives. At the same time, it is building platform and an infrastructure for what could be, in the long run, an incredibly transformative technology.
Andy, a lot of people immediately compare this to Elon Musk-backed Neuralink. How do these two approaches differ, and what are the pros and cons of these two technical paths?
Sure. Well, that's exactly the point, Ghana, right? So I think Neuralink's approach and maybe Elon Musk's approach, and maybe even we can call it the American approach, is, very, in a way, science fiction like. What if, we could, use our brains to control a television, control a robot, et cetera? What if we can put a man on Mars? So this is, again, it's a valuable way to approach the world to achieve scientific breakthroughs, but it might not be the best way to efficiently and quickly deliver tangible, practical impact at scale. So, and this, Neuralink versus Neuracle, I think, is a great example of that. So Neuralink is taking this approach of not only going inside the skull, but then penetrating the dura, so this covering over the brain, into the brain with electrodes. And why that's useful is that you can collect more data, more signal from the neurons themselves. But the trade-off is that this is risky. These implants are supposed to be long-term. What happens if the electrodes erode? And I think Neuralink already has encountered some issues. So, this is, I think, risky for the patient. It is, I think, systemically also a harder thing to gain approval, medical approval for, to roll out in hospitals. Now, if you look at the Chinese approach, first of all, this approach of placing a device on the dura, you get population level signal, which is good enough to let you control, again, like this robotic glove. But it might not be enough to let you do maybe more sophisticated gee whiz kind of things, but it still solves a very real problem. But it is also incredibly practical from a regulatory and a surgical perspective as well, because this is the kind of thing that hospitals and regulators and medical ethics boards are already familiar with, and that there are already similar kinds of devices that are proven. So this is again, I think it's a more scalable path, but maybe lacks some of the excitement or the sexiness of, saying you can do amazing things with BCI or electrodes implanted in your brain.
Mm-hmm. Andy, one last question, very briefly. Neuracle is a Shanghai-based company, right? Why do you think Shanghai, rather than Shenzhen or Hangzhou, has become the innovation hub for breakthrough BCI achievements?
Yeah, great question, Ghana. So I think very briefly, it's because Shanghai, so every part of China, the Greater Bay Area, Hangzhou, Shanghai, Beijing, all have strengths in this area. I think first that's important to point out. But I think Shanghai, being designated as a center of excellence for this, for three reasons: hospitals, neuroscience research, and then medical device manufacturing. So these are really the three areas that have to come together. And of course, there's AI and semiconductors as well. But because of these three broad constellations of expertise, I think makes Shanghai, the choice of why the government has said we want Shanghai to be at the forefront.
Indeed. Thanks, Andy, for those insightful analysis. That's all the time for this edition of World Today. Thank you so much for listening.